What's up, guys? It's your boy here, John the Morgile, checking in for, I guess this will be number 4 of debating Globetards. And this time we're going to talk about satellites, because this is, I'm recording. This time we're going to talk about satellites, because this is a big one, man. A lot of people seem to equate technological progress, like, actual, tangible, practical technologies that are invented indeed by scientific sort of inquiry and scientific expansion and everything. But people seem to equate actual practical science with theoretical science, which the two things are actually antithetical to one another. The term theoretical science is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because science inherently implies sort of hands-on, practical, verifiable, as well as falsifiable endeavors and experimentation in order to arrive at conclusions that must be at least closer to the truth, right? One way or another, okay? However, theoretical necessarily, inherently implies the concept of something being abstract and non-tangible and, of course, sort of imaginary, theoretical, okay? And certainly space, the concept of space, infinite space, and the globe Earth infinite space hypothesis falls in that category because the average person does not have the ability to either verify or falsify certain claims. I'll give you one off the top of my head. The claim that the sun is a 93 million mile distant object made out of the lightest gases known to people, like hydrogen and helium. However, these lightest gases, which somehow do not explode but go through a theoretical process of hot atomic fusion, are so dense somehow that they generate this massive gravity. The whole thing is, of course, ridiculous, but these claims, whether you love them or not, these claims made by so-called science, theoretical science, which is in fact anti-science, are neither demonstrable, nor are they verifiable, nor are they falsifiable, which means they are exactly pseudoscience. Like, that's the definition of pseudoscience, right? And so, again, the whole sort of diatribe that I'm going on about here is the fact that theoretical science is not the same thing as practical science. They're completely two different things. Practical science is certainly deserving of the name science because there are tangible results based on facts that are arrived at by hands-on experience and experimentation, whereas the very nature of theoretical science is the exact opposite of that. So you can't really even call it science. You actually should call it, again, anti-science. So with all of that being said, what we're going to talk about in this episode of, if you want to call it that even, this entry of debating Globetards is, of course, satellites. Because satellites are something that are claimed to be the sort of a marriage of practical science and theoretical science, right? Because clearly, if there's some thousands and thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth at various distances, ranging from like 300 miles, as they claim, with the ISS, in just below the lower magnetosphere, as they say, or like the geosynchronous satellites some 22,000 miles away, which are the ones that they claim provide us with things like mobile data, cell phone service, right? So sort of an interesting thing occurred to me this evening, which I think is a valid point, or at least an illustration of the point that is made against this notion of satellites being, 22,000 mile away distant objects communicating with the generic-ass little plastic and metal dishes on the side of your house and the little transceiver in your cell phone. These sorts of claims are ridiculous, even by the Globetards standards, of course, because the first thing that they'll tell you is, well, the satellites communicate with the radio towers, and the radio towers communicate with your cell phone, but that doesn't really solve the issue. But let's just illustrate this the way that it occurred to me today as a practical illustration of how absurd that their claims are. So in the hotel that I'm at, of course, there is high-speed internet, wireless. Hotels these days seem to, or at least motels, seem to not have the actual data cables, the good old RJ45 data cables, and so you sort of have to rely on Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi at this hotel is lackluster at very best. Like, even if you go walk up to the office, just a few feet away from the Wi-Fi thing or whatever, you can barely get a good signal, at least uploading. In the room that I'm staying at, which is no more than 100 feet away from their Wi-Fi signal, right, their router or whatever, there's a couple of walls in between, of course, but I do have a signal repeater and amplifier, and it's just the connectivity is absolute garbage. It's a dumpster fire, right? And we're talking about 100 feet at the most, but we're expected to believe that somehow there is, and again, the geosynchronous satellites that they claim are about 22,000 miles in altitude, as they say, and they're supposedly sending and receiving signals from either your dish or from a main dish, like at the cable company, which, yes, the cable company alleges to get all their data from satellites as well as the cell phones, the satellite dishes. All of these things are supposedly communicating with radio towers, which are all around us, and they cover miles and miles of distance in terms of connectivity, these 4G sort of radio towers, right? But at the end of the day, this entire system, they allege, is reliant upon geosynchronous satellites, which are ultimately 22,000 miles in altitude. And the concept, just that very concept, is so absurd according to their very own proclamations and their very own doctrine. So, for example, we all have heard the term solar wind and solar radiation, and any Globetard will verify that their shtick, their belief, is that the sun's radiation would basically kill everything on Earth and make it a barren wasteland were it not for the magnetic field of the Earth, the ionosphere, these different sort of layers of protective barriers against radiation from the sun. So literally, like, the Earth, the ball Earth in theory, is a perfect sort of, has a perfect sort of filter or like a defense against radiation. And yet, however, something as small as and if you research the sort of the power and the frequency and the amount of energy that is being put out, the radioactive radiation energy, the radio frequency waves being put out by these satellite dishes, these satellites, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's nothing compared to solar radiation. It's a drop in the bucket. And another thing that's very important is you can't demonstrate radio frequency waves being transmitted thousands and thousands of miles without natural attenuation of the frequency, which is basically the spreading out or the lack of clarity of radio frequency waves as they travel through space. You know, there's a direct proportion between clarity and proximity. And so, you know, at the end of the day, we already know that technologies developed by people like Nikola Tesla back in the early 1900s, and also technologies utilized by the United States military during World War II at the very latest, for sure. I know they were using weather balloons in order to increase their signal amplification range, right? And so, practically speaking, weather balloons, especially arrays of weather balloons, and especially sort of controllable geosynchronous weather balloons that, you know, you can spend a lot of money on these things and have them basically hover over a spot without moving an inch, especially with today's technology. But when you have arrays of these weather balloons that are all sort of acting as a like a conglomerate transceiver, a conglomerate radio antenna, that would be, first of all, way cheaper, way more practical, way better. Like in every sense, it would be way better than this concept of satellites some 20,000 miles away. Like the concept of putting your main hub of your radio frequency network 20,000 miles away is absurd, especially when we've had and utilized and perfected technologies using arrays of high altitude weather balloons equipped with basically what you would call satellite technology. It makes perfect sense. And so this, the concept that we are somehow reliant upon satellites to achieve what we have today as the sort of mobile internet, which is oftentimes much better than the Wi-Fi that we get, to believe that you need satellites to achieve that is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Nikola Tesla had mapped this technology out and spelled it out in the early 1900s. And of course, my grandfather told me stories about he and the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II literally used weather balloons in order to get an edge on the Germans and the Axis forces. So, the whole idea that we needed to create the lie factory that is NASA by importing literal Nazi scientists, SS officers into the United States black budget government in order to achieve NASA, the whole thing is laughable and absurd. So I think this one's gone on long enough, but to the spirit of what this video is, debating Globetards about satellites is yet another example of how you need to explain to the typical person that believes, and I wouldn't even call typical people that believe the Earth is a ball Globetards. Okay, so let me be clear on that at least. What I would call Globetards are people that have been confronted with the evidence against the ball and yet refuse to believe it and insist on slinging ad hominem attacks against one's character or sanity or knowledge of the topic instead of actually thinking about the points that are raised. That would be a Globetard. And so when you're debating, your average globe Earth believer about satellites, you first need to explain to them exactly what it is they believe about satellites and also explain to them their lack of understanding of how radio frequency waves work and how the whole thing is absurd. Even if you humor the globe Earth hypothesis, look at the Loran system that was used by navigators on the sea. They were bouncing radio frequency waves off of what they called the ionosphere. And then they didn't even have, apparently, arrays of weather balloons or satellites or anything. And in fact, if you look at just the way that communications developed around World War II, way before there were supposedly even ever any satellites, they had the ability to send wirelessly communication signals, and I believe they were always using Tesla technology the entire time, all along, and they just sort of reframed or sort of recouched Tesla technology as space technology, and that's really the whole big thing of the scam. Is just like they did with Tesla's inventions pertaining to electricity, they wanted to capitalize on his inventions rather than enriching the public with his inventions. So too they did with communications, but I would venture to say that the way that they sort of perverted the communications aspects of Tesla technologies was way more insidious than the sort of energy technologies. But maybe that yet remains to be seen, doesn't it? Maybe I'm way off on that, but I don't know. At least that's the way that it seems, obviously, at this point. So anyway, all right, this has been almost a 15-minute one. Love you guys. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.